People over time who came to Colorado had great dreams and aspirations, that they built enduring communities and they shaped the landscape while the landscape was shaping them in return.
The Eastern Plains signifies something that all Coloradans can be proud of, and that is this real American spirit. I mean, the folks that came and settled this place came as 19 and 20-year-old married couples that didn't speak English. They didn't have any money, and they built a new life for themselves, and they really dug in, and they worked so hard.
And Keota is about the dreams, it's about the landscape, it's about the community that existed here that even survived the lifespan of the town. Although Keota is gone as a town today, the people who live there still think of this as their home.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you.
First I'll show you the homestead house that my father built. And I was born right there, in the bedroom right there. My sister was born there too. It was sort of like survival from one day to the next. You survived, but we were happy because everybody was the same. You didn't know any different. You didn't know luxury. So you were happy.
One of the really fascinating aspects of a place like Keota is the way that people came out here. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which essentially gave away government land to families who wanted to own a piece of America, a piece of land, something they could call their own. In 1887, the year that Keota was founded, much of the interior West was still unsettled. There were still people coming out, farmers and even city dwellers who were looking to start a new life on the plains of Colorado or Nebraska or Kansas or Oklahoma.
Keota's story really begins with the railroad, slices through the Eastern Plains and makes this sort of triangle in the state between Nebraska and Cheyenne. And the railroad plots these little towns about 10 miles apart from each other. The government comes in and it surveys the land and divides it into these neat rectangles or boxes that we associate with Eastern Plains or with the Great Plains in general. Together, the government and the railroad promote settlement to the Eastern Plains. So there are these two big monolithic forces that are really trying to pull people to the plains and to get them settled. So that's how our little tiny town becomes Keota. It wasn't extraordinary. There were 5, 6, 7 other towns plotted by the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy Railroad line that comes through. So it's just this little speck on the prairie.
It was a pretty remote, arid, you could argue desolate place, but also a place of great beauty and wonder and just an overpowering sense of nature in the environment.
Be careful of raptors. That's rattlesnakes.
Here's where I was born, 1924. This bed right in this corner. 86 years ago I was born here.
Oh, I'm propping up the corner of the house because there's no support on this corner and I don't want the whole corner to fall in. I want the old house to last at least as long as I do.
People come to this place, which is a dry and desolate place. We don't get more than 12 inches of precipitation a year on the Eastern Plains, but they come from all over the world. Some of them come from the East Coast looking to start a new life. Some of them come from Russia. They're ethnically German, but they come from Russia. A lot of people come from Scandinavian countries, but they're pulled to this place. A lot of them stepping off the train for the first time, not knowing what it's going to look like, not seeing an environment that reminds them of their homeland. And I can only imagine what kinds of emotions must have been going through their mind when they see this place where you don't have a tree in sight. It's a subtle beauty that I think a lot of people don't necessarily associate with Colorado. It's not that rugged mountains, it's not trees, it's not bubbling streams or brooks. It's a beauty you have to really look for.
The weather is something terrible out here in the wintertime. Wind usually blows 40 miles an hour on a light day, and probably who knows how much on a bad day.
The Eastern Plains is a land of extremes. It is extremely hot, blistering sun in the summer, and frigid cold, ceaseless winds. And when it snows out there, there is a real fear of blizzards. It's not the amount of snow that comes, it's the fact that once it snows and the snow's on the ground, the winds pick it up and keep it going.
Yeah, I've seen it 20 below here. And when the wind ain't blowing, you can stand 20 below real easy, but when the wind's blowing, you get that chill factor, and boy, it's cold.
There were two young boys who the parents had left to go to an adjoining homestead, and the boys wandered outside in a blizzard and died. They were found just a few feet away from their house, but they couldn't see. And so it wasn't uncommon to have some sort of a piece of string or yarn that was connected from your house to your barn to your outhouse, because if you get disoriented and lose sight because of the whipping winds and that blowing snow, it can be fatal. And it was a lesson that the townspeople never forgot. It hit them really hard because it was such a small community, and they took it seriously.
The people who came to places like Keota were mostly interested in agriculture. They were ranching, but primarily they were dryland farming, growing crops like pinto beans or potatoes, but mostly dryland wheat. Winter wheat was the major crop that farmers around Keota grew in the 19-teens and early 1920s.
In the dry land, for 1 year of good crops and rainfall, you'd have 7 years of drought. It just sort of seemed to be a cycle. And if it wasn't the drought, there was the plagues. We had grasshopper plagues 1 year where they ate all the crops. We had little green worms plague 1 year where you couldn't step outside without stepping in worms. And then 1 year we'd have locusts plague, and those were horrible because what a screeching noise they made. And so you had all these elements to contend with.
The women in these families cooked and cleaned and tended to kitchen gardens, which was often the difference between success or failure, or hunger and not. And they raised chickens and collected eggs, and they kept cows, and it was a ceaseless work. But yet they were really invested in this place and in the community. One of the phenomena we see with the Homestead Act is that families will create homesteads next to each other. So they'll file on adjoining claims, and they'll create these little centers of 4 boxes coming together, and all of the families have their homes right around each other because there's nothing for miles. There's no neighbors for miles. So there's a big family kinship network that pulls folks here.
Well, we always had our cousins. We always had our grandmother and my Uncle John. The 3 brothers were a mile apart, and we'd always have somebody to visit.
Yeah, you remember the newspaper guy, Tailspin Tommy, from
yes.
Briggsdale?
Yes.
They come out one Sunday. Mom had invited them for fried chicken dinner. So they came out, and Tommy Thompson was his name, and he was so mad because he forgot his teeth. He really had to gum that chicken, and he was so mad at himself.
One family in particular really laid deep roots down in Keota. A young man named Clyde Stanley moved to Keota in the early 19-teens. He was a newspaper editor. And he also ran the general store, and in time was also the land commissioner who registered the homestead claims of new arrivals in Keota.
He was really a town booster and kind of becomes the center of town and runs a general store there that also is the post office and has a lending library. He traveled around to the adjacent communities on an Indian motorcycle, and he traveled around with a little typewriter, and he would go and collect people's news. This is happening in a time before we really have ways of communicating with each other. When you're on your homestead, you could go days without talking to somebody that you weren't related to, who wasn't in your family, and so people were really desperate for that interchange of news, for a place to come together. Community centers, they didn't really exist then. So the general store became that place. It was the place in the community where people came to just chat, to exchange news of the day.
Telephones were beginning to come online, and Keota had its own local telephone exchange, but a lot of business and communication with the outside world still took place on railroads and on the telegraph. What's fascinating about this is that the railroad and the telegraph really linked Keota, for better or for worse, to a global economy. You could go to Clyde Stanley's store and make an order in Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward. You could have anything from long underwear to farm equipment to a pig oiler.
You could get a lot of stuff. You could even get live animals, livestock, chickens. We'd order chickens from Montgomery Ward. One time my father even bought a little dog, a little rat terrier dog. And we were scared of it. We'd jump on the chair. I can still remember that.
You could buy an entire house in Chicago and have it delivered to you by the train to set up in Keota. It gave farmers in remote places like Keota access to a global market. And that was both a good thing and a bad thing. It made them susceptible to the whims of the marketplace. So goods might be expensive, but you can't sell your wheat for prices that are comparable, and those wheat prices are set in Chicago. So all the good things come from Chicago, but a lot of bad things come from Chicago too.
This is a town that never has more than 140 people, but at the same time it has hotels and it has ice cream shops, it has a pool hall, it has a barber, it has a doctor that lives in town, also travels to outlying towns, but it has a general store, it has a literary society, it has a cornet band, it has multiple churches, it has a school, which is really a social center for the town.
Any function at school, all the parents participated in. I mean, they came to all the basketball games, all the athletic events. We had pie socials, where all the ladies would bring a pie and they would auction it off and the men would bid on it. We'd compete with other schools in singing contests and math. We'd have math contests with the other schools. We'd have penmanship contests. I remember my sister was very good at penmanship. I don't think they teach penmanship today.
This was really an educated group of people that were invested in this place, and it was hopping. On Saturdays, folks from the adjoining homesteads would bring their goods into Clyde Stanley's store because they would trade for groceries. It was also really a social time. We have accounts of buggies being lined up along their main street, which was Roanoke Avenue, and our Model Ts and other cars in town as well. But it was a social center, and I think people craved that human interaction just like they do today, but it was harder to find, and so you had to actively seek it out. But Saturdays in town, it was a big deal.
We all lived there, and none of us thought we were poor, which we didn't, because we had the love of family, and I think that's what draws a lot of families together, is the love that they showed for each other.
Rose Ball is another person from Keota. Both of her grandparents had homesteads, so she was that little girl. I mean, if anything is similar to the lives we lead today, she was that little girl that had two grandparents' farms just down the road.
My dad, I remember, worked late hours getting people's cars fixed. I know he was a good mechanic, and people really trusted him. And he'd go out even though it was snow on the ground and lay under the car to fix it so they could get going again.
This is a time when Americans are starting to have some increased mobility because we now have automobiles, and so once you have automobiles, you need gas stations and you need repair shops. So she's living in town. She's not living on a homestead. She's not living on a farm. She has led a very hard life. A lot of tragic things have happened. You know, her sister, who was her soulmate and playmate, died of leukemia, and her dad got MS and couldn't support the family. And you know, these are everyday challenges that we all face, but this was in a time without medical assistance. I mean, there was really nothing that they could do. It was just sort of fate taking over. This town of Keota was not built by rich and famous people. It was built by everyday people living extraordinary lives and working so hard every day of their life. And they think nothing extraordinary of what it was that they did. And Rose is one of those examples.
The really good things in Keota came unfortunately during a time of global conflict. Because of the First World War, farmers in America were really feeding people in Europe, and wheat prices as a result were incredibly high.
It happens to be raining in the years prior to World War I, so times are good. Farmers are putting more land into cultivation. They are going into debt buying new equipment to farm the land. So there's this real boom cycle.
As a farmer, you could go into the West, you could get a lot of free land, and you could grow wheat, and for a while anyway, the cash rolled in. The cutting edge of that was once the war ended, the need for what Keota farmers could produce just evaporated. The end of the war really changed conditions in places like Keota. With the end of the war, crop prices really began to collapse, and it became harder and harder for farmers in places like Keota to stay ahead. Many of them had gone into debt during the war buying tractors to increase the amount of land that they could place under cultivation. And when the prices of wheat dropped at the end of the war, many farmers found themselves underwater. They simply couldn't make enough on their crops to pay the debts that they had incurred during the good times.
At the same time, World War I takes a tremendous toll on this little town. There are a large number of veterans, of young boys that go off to fight. When your town is 140 people and you lose 15 to war, that is a big amount of your population. At the same time, the Spanish flu epidemic hits Keota like so many other towns in Colorado, and it hits it hard. The Spanish flu began during World War I with the troops. It was brought from Europe back to the United States by the troops. It started in Kansas, and from there it spread like wildfire. And it hits young mothers and healthy people. This is a strain of flu that doesn't take the youngest and the oldest like others do, but it's hitting this kind of core population, that same population that's really being affected by servicemen going off to fight. Silverton actually has the highest mortality rate per capita of any community in the United States because it's an isolated community. The flu gets in, it snows, the mountain passes are jammed up for the winter, and it doesn't get out. Other towns like Gunnison take an opposite point of view. Gunnison is quarantined. You can't enter Gunnison during this time. You know, it is scary, and there's a lot of products that you see in catalogs like Montgomery Ward and Steers and Roebuck that are a direct result of this. So all sorts of cleaning supplies and disinfectants, but people were scared. If you wander through Keota's graveyard or any graveyard from this time, the amount of graves that you see that are marked 1918, 1919, it's sad and it's heartbreaking. And there were entire families that were wiped out in this town.
People couldn't make a living farming because of the drought situation. So many people left. My father didn't leave, and someone asked me why he didn't leave, and he said he had no money to start up anyplace else.
The Great Depression began in the 1930s, but for farmers, the Depression really began in the 1920s. As crop prices began to fall at the end of the war, farmers began to expand and go into deeper debt in order to stay ahead. And that just drove overproduction, which further lowered the prices of crops. And farmers found themselves in a spiral of debt that just kept getting deeper and deeper, even 10 years before the stock market crashed.
Times are hard in this town for everyone. And the women all understand how hard it is that they work. The men are all trying to support their families on these homesteads that are very small. And when the weather doesn't cooperate, it doesn't cooperate.
One of the real tragedies of this great agricultural boom of the 19-teens is that it set the stage for a massive environmental collapse in the 1930s. Because of this cycle of mechanization and overproduction and debt and further overproduction, farmers plowed more and more land, and they took away the topsoil of the prairie, which anchored the soil in place. And by the conditions of intense drought in the 1930s, that soil simply blew away. Farmers in Colorado would joke that they had to go to Texas to farm because that's where their farm had landed.
You prayed for rain. If you heard rain,
I still love to hear rain on the roof because it always reminds me of home. Other people complain about the rain and I love it. No matter how much it rains, I love it. Because you used to pray for rain so the crops would grow. Because that was your livelihood.
Keota effectively was finished as an agricultural town by the mid-1920s, and in many ways the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl simply represented the last nails in the coffin.
Oh my.
If you went to Keota today, you would have no idea the extent to which this was a vibrant and thriving community. Mostly what you see are remains of buildings. The general store, still standing but just barely, the remains of the Methodist church, which are boarded up, the steps of the school just kind of rising out of the prairie. There's also fire plugs in the middle of the prairie. There are street signs, just look like they're growing out of the grasslands. The water tower is still there, it's painted Keota. Many of the images we have, the aerial images, were taken from that. Clyde Stanley loved to climb the water tower and take photos of the town. He was really a glue that held this town together. He was a town booster. He believed in this place and really invested his life in it. He was there for the boom days when the town did have 140 people, and he was one of the last residents. He was there when the town had 6 people. So when I think about the arc of his life and what he saw, I'm so conflicted thinking that, you know, he saw this place and everything that he envisioned it would be, and successful and booming, and this really just surprising story on the Eastern Plains, and to help create such a rich community life. And he also saw when times weren't good and when it stopped raining and people started to move away.
it's part of our life.
It's part of our historical life. We grew up here and you can't erase that ever.
I think it's because the stories have kept going from one generation to the next, and they just want to stay together and remember each other.
The Keota reunion was started about 25 years ago by descendants of the Speaker and the Hart families, and these were 2 families that had adjoining homesteads next to each other, and each family had very, very large families. The reunion is now run by nieces who never lived in Keota, never lived in this place. One lives in St. Louis, one lives in New Mexico. People come from California. They're not from Keota in the conventional sense, but yet they identify with this place and this story, and they come back every year, and it is going home for them. It is the family homestead.
Just the camaraderie of those of us who are left is why we get together, and it's just a fun thing to do. I just don't think of going to Colorado, not going out to the Keota.
Keota represents the dreams that we all have when we come to a place like Colorado. This place is a magnet for our dreams of who we want to be.
You could say that the town was a failure, It wasn't. It was an enduring community that has stayed with people, and people identify with this place in a way that a lot of Americans don't today.
A place like Keota provided opportunities to start a new life, to own a piece of land, to grow and to prosper and to settle down. But it also reminds us that it's not always easy to live here, that it takes great courage and persistence, and it takes communities like Keota to depend on each other in order to succeed in this beautiful but challenging place.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you. This episode is available on Blu-ray. Visit our website to order. There's more Colorado Experience online at rmpbs.org/Colorado Experience, Facebook and Twitter.